A man walks toward Jesus on a road outside Capernaum. He is not supposed to be on this road. He is not supposed to be anywhere near other people. By law, by custom, by the hard weight of religious tradition, he is required to walk with his head low and his voice loud. Not loud in the way of celebration, but loud in the way of warning. End quote. Unclean, end quote. He is supposed to call out. End quote. Unclean, end quote. So that you can step off the road before he gets close. So that he cannot accidentally contaminate you. So that the gap between his body and yours remains exactly as wide as it needs to be to keep you safe. He has been doing this for years. He cannot remember the last time someone touched him. And then he sees Jesus coming the other way on the road, and something happens inside him that nobody in his position is supposed to feel. Hope. Not the dull, managed hope of someone who has learned to want very little. The sharp, dangerous kind. The kind that can destroy you if it doesn't and oppose. Come through. He falls on his knees. The crowd around Jesus pulls back. Of course they do. This man is unclean, and the purity laws are clear, and nobody wants to stand too close to the thing that might cost them something. But the man on his knees looks up and says one sentence. End quote. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. End quote. If you are willing. Not. End quote. If you are able. End quote. He already believed Jesus could do it. The question was whether Jesus would. Whether any of this enormous power moving through the world would stop and turn its face toward someone like him. Jesus steps forward, toward the man, not away. He reaches out his hand. He touches him. That touch alone, before a single word is spoken, is already the miracle. Because this man had not been touched by another human being in years. And the first touch was not a physician and oppose. Clinical inspection. It was not a cautious pat. It was the touch of someone who had chosen, deliberately, to cross the line everyone else had drawn. End quote. I am willing, end quote. Jesus says. End quote. Be clean, end quote. And in the Greek of Matthew and Apos' Gospel, the word used for what moved Jesus at this moment, the word used every single time Jesus heals someone in the first three Gospels, is splagnizomai. It is one of the most visceral words in the New Testament. It doesn't endopos, mean sympathy. It doesn't endopos, mean pity. It means a compassion so physical, so gut level, that you feel it in your chest and your stomach before your mind has caught up. The ancient Greeks used it to describe what happened to your insides when you saw your child fall, when you watched someone drown, when you couldn't endopos, not move toward the suffering. This is how Jesus performs every single miracle in the Gospels. Not from a distance, not from power alone, but from that word, splagnizomai. This is not a magic show. This is not a catalog of impressive moments. This is not a theology lecture about the divine nature of Christ. This is the story of what happened every time a broken person came close enough to Jesus that he could see their face. There are 37 distinct miracles recorded in the four Gospels. Some scholars count more. Some count fewer, depending on whether you separate parallel accounts. But across all of them, the healings, the nature miracles, the resurrections, one thing stays constant. Every single one of them is personal. And there is one miracle, one moment, where Jesus does something before the healing that no one ever talks about. A single breath. A sound that escapes before the power goes out. We will come back to that. But not yet. The first miracle Jesus ever performed was at a wedding. Not a healing. Not a resurrection. Not a dramatic confrontation with darkness. A wedding. In Cana of Galilee, a small town that doesn't endopos, appear anywhere else in ancient literature except this single story. The guests had been celebrating for days, as was the custom. And then the wine ran out. You have to understand what that meant in that culture. A wedding feast could last a week. Running out of wine before it ended wasn't endopos, just an inconvenience. It was a social disaster. It would follow the family for years. The embarrassment would outlast the celebration by decades. Mary, the mother of Jesus, finds him in the crowd and tells him quietly, end quote, they have no wine, end quote. Jesus says, in one of the strangest sentences in all the Gospels, end quote, woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come, end quote. Not end quote, mom, end quote, not end quote, mother, end quote, woman. Formal. Almost formal enough to sting. And yet, and this is what most people miss, Mary doesn't endopos, argue with him. She doesn't and oppose T defend herself. She just turns to the servants and says, with complete calm, end quote, do whatever he tells you, end quote. She already knows what and oppose is coming. Jesus looks at 6 stone water jars standing near the entrance, each one the size of a barrel, used for ceremonial washing, holding somewhere between 20 and 30 gallons apiece. He tells the servants to fill them all to the brim with water. They do. Then he tells them to draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. The master of the banquet tastes it and calls the bridegroom over with a puzzled expression. End quote. Everyone serves the good wine first, end quote. He says, end quote, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now, end quote. He doesn't end oppose. T know it was water 20 minutes ago. Jesus did not announce this miracle. He did not gather a crowd. He performed it in the margins of a party, with servants as witnesses, to spare a family a humiliation nobody else in the room had noticed yet. The first miracle was not for power or prestige. It was for 2 people who would have been embarrassed at their own wedding. Stay with me, because this pattern is going to follow Jesus all the way to the cross. Now move forward in time to a road outside Jericho. There is a man sitting in the dust at the edge of the road named Bartimaeus. His father and Oppos' name was Timaeus, which is how we know his. In the ancient world, a blind man by the road in Jericho had almost no status, no income, and no future except the coins dropped by passing strangers. He was, by every social measure, invisible. He hears a noise coming down the road. Voices. Movement. More people than usual. He asks what an Oppos is happening, and someone tells him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. Bartimaeus begins to shout, end quote, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me, end quote. The people around him tell him to be quiet. Multiple times. The word in Greek is epitomeo, the same word used when Jesus rebukes demons. They are silencing him with the full weight of social disapproval. You do not shout at a rabbi like this. You do not embarrass yourself like this. You do not draw attention in a way that makes everyone uncomfortable. Bartimaeus shouts louder, end quote, Son of David, have mercy on me, end quote. And Jesus stops. In a crowd that could have been hundreds of people, on a road busy with pilgrims heading to Jerusalem, Jesus stops walking and says 3 words, end quote, call him here, end quote. They tell Bartimaeus. And something happens that Mark records with one specific, telling detail. Bartimaeus throws off his cloak, jumps to his feet, and comes to Jesus. That cloak was everything a beggar owned. It was his sleeping mat, his rain protection, his only real possession. He throws it away before he can even see where he and Oppos' going, trusting that he won and Oppos' needed anymore. Jesus looks at him and asks a question that sounds almost unnecessary, end quote. What do you want me to do for you? End quote. He and Oppos' blind. It seems obvious. But Jesus asks anyway, because Bartimaeus deserves to say it out loud. He deserves to be heard asking for the specific thing that has been denied him his whole life. End quote. Rabbi, let me recover my sight. End quote. End quote. Go, end quote. Jesus says. End quote. Your faith has healed you. End quote. Immediately. The Greek is euthes, immediately, suddenly, at once. Now here and Oppos' the part nobody tells you about this story. Mark and Oppos' gospel tells us what Bartimaeus does after he can see. He doesn't and Oppos' go home. He doesn't and Oppos' go find his family. He doesn't and Oppos' stand in the road and stare at his hands. He follows Jesus down the road. He follows him toward Jerusalem, toward the cross. One more story before the midpoint, and this one is quieter, harder. 10 men with leprosy approach Jesus near the border of Samaria and Galilee. They keep their distance, as the law required, but they call out, end quote, Jesus, Master, have pity on us, end quote. Jesus tells them to go show themselves to the priests, which was the standard requirement for anyone claiming to be healed of a skin disease. The men start walking toward the priests, and as they walk, they are healed. 10 men healed. One comes back. Just one. He is a Samaritan, which means the other 9 were Jewish, and they had accepted the miracle, accepted the healing, and gone on with their lives. The Samaritan throws himself at Jesus and Oppos' feet, praising God. Jesus looks around at the road, empty now except for this one man. End quote. He says it with something quieter than rage, something closer to grief, because he had healed all 10. He had healed people who walked away. And that says something about the miracles we have to hold. They were not transactional. They were not gifts given only to the grateful. If you have made it this far, the leper touched before he was healed, the quiet wedding miracle, the beggar who threw away his only possession before he could even see, you are starting to see the pattern. Jesus never performed a miracle to impress. He performed every single one because he saw a specific person in a specific kind of pain, and he could not look at that pain and do nothing. If this kind of deep read Bible content is something you want more of, hit subscribe right now and ring the notification bell, because we cover stories like this every single week, and I, Don and Apos, want you to miss the next one. Which of these miracles hit you hardest so far? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Now, back to the miracles. There is a story in the 9th chapter of John that begins with a question so coldly logical it still makes people uncomfortable. Jesus and his disciples are walking through Jerusalem when they see a man who has been blind since birth. He is not new to this street. He is not a stranger to them. He has been there long enough that the disciples have had time to form a theory about why. They ask Jesus, and quote, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" End quote. This was a serious theological question in first-century Judaism. Suffering had to have a cause. Disability had to be someone and Apos' fault. If you were born with something wrong, the framework of the day said it was punishment, either your own sin, somehow, or your parents and Apos. The disciples are not being cruel. They are being completely orthodox. Jesus refuses the entire framework. End quote. It was not that this man sinned, or his parents. He was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. End quote. Pay attention to this. Because Jesus is not just healing a blind man here. He is dismantling a theology of suffering that had been crushing people for centuries. The idea that disability is divine punishment, that pain is proof of guilt, that the broken are broken because they deserve to be. Jesus looks at this man and says, "Your blindness is not a verdict. It is not evidence against you." Then he does something strange. He spits on the ground, makes mud, and spreads it on the man and Apos' eyes. Tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. The man goes. He washes. He comes back seeing. And then the Real story begins. Because the neighbors and religious leaders Don and Apos celebrate. They argue. They haul the man in front of the Pharisees. They interrogate him about how exactly this happened and who did it. They interrogate his parents. His parents, afraid of being thrown out of the synagogue, step back from it. End quote. He is of age. Ask him, end quote. So the Pharisees ask the man a second time, and what he gives them is not a theological statement. It is just logic. End quote. Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, I was blind. Now I see, end quote. They keep pushing. The man keeps pushing back. Finally, tired of the circular questioning, he looks at the religious experts with what can only be described as astonishing calm and says, end quote, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" End quote. They throw him out. And when Jesus hears that the man has been thrown out, he goes and finds him. That is the part of this story most people miss entirely. The miracle is almost secondary. The center of John chapter 9 is not that a blind man received sight. It, and Apos, that the man who received sight was thrown out of his community for telling the truth, and Jesus went to find him specifically because he had been thrown out. Now watch what happens next. Jairus is a ruler of the synagogue in Capernaum, a man of status, a man of religious authority, a man who spends his days presiding over the very institution that has been increasingly hostile to Jesus. He has colleagues. He has a reputation. He has things to lose. He falls at Jesus and Apos' feet in public. His 12-year-old daughter is dying. He has nowhere else to go. Jesus goes with him immediately and then gets delayed. A woman in the crowd, who has been bleeding for 12 years, reaches out and touches the hem of his garment. Jesus stops and says, end quote, "Who touched me?" End quote. His disciples are confused. There are people pressing in on every side. Everyone is touching him. But Jesus says he felt dynamis go out from him. Dynamis, the Greek word for miracle power, force, the energy of the divine. Something had left him. The woman comes forward, terrified. She explains. And Jesus looks at her. This woman who has spent 12 years sick, spent everything she had on doctors who couldn't and oppose. To help her, spent 12 years as ceremonially unclean and untouchable, and he calls her daughter. End quote. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. End quote. While he and Oppos, still speaking, messengers arrive from Jairus and Oppos' house. End quote. Your daughter is dead. Don and Oppos, bother the teacher anymore. End quote. Jesus turns to Jairus and says something you could not say to a man who has just learned his daughter is dead unless you were absolutely certain. End quote. Do not be afraid. Only believe. End quote. He walks to the house, clears out the mourners, who laugh at him when he says the girl is only sleeping. He goes into the room with only the parents and 3 disciples. He takes the girl and Oppos' hand. He speaks in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, the language of the temple, not in Greek, the language of the educated. In Aramaic, the language her mother had spoken to her every night since she was born. The language of bedtime and meals and ordinary tenderness. Talithacom. End quote. Little girl, get up. End quote. She gets up. He tells her parents to give her something to eat. Even in the middle of the resurrection of a child, Jesus thinks of the immediate, practical, human need. She is 12. She has been ill. She is probably hungry. There is one more miracle before the largest. And it is, on the surface, the strangest. Jesus has just fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. He sends the disciples across the Sea of Galilee in a boat while he goes up a mountain alone to pray. In the middle of the night, in the middle of the sea, in the middle of a storm, they see a figure walking toward them on the water. They are terrified. They think it and Oppos, a ghost. Jesus calls out, end quote, take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid, end quote. And Peter, impulsive, loud, passionate Peter, says, end quote, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water, end quote. Jesus says one word, end quote, come, end quote. Peter gets out of the boat. He walks on water. He is doing the impossible because Jesus said a single word and Peter believed it. And then Peter looks at the wind. He looks at the waves. He looks at what is happening around him instead of at Jesus, and he sinks. But here is the miracle within the miracle. Jesus catches him. Immediately. Euthes. The same word. The moment Peter starts to go under, the hand is already there. End quote. You have little faith, end quote, Jesus says. End quote. Why did you doubt? End quote. It is one of the gentlest rebukes in the Bible. Not, end quote. I can and Oppos, believe you failed, end quote. But, end quote, you were doing it. Why did you stop? End quote. There is a village called Bethany, about 2 miles east of Jerusalem, sitting on the slope of the Mount of Olives. In that village live 3 people Jesus loved in a way that is specific enough that John and Oppos' gospel names it 3 times in 11 verses. Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. Lazarus gets sick. Mary and Martha send word to Jesus. The message is simple, almost formal in its restraint. End quote. Lord, the one you love is sick. End quote. They are not asking him to come. They don and Oppos, say, end quote, come quickly, end quote. They just tell him. Because they believe that simply knowing is enough. That when Jesus hears his friend is dying, he will move. Jesus hears the news and stays where he is for 2 more days. This is one of the most uncomfortable moments in the Gospels, and John does nothing to soften it. He reports the delay plainly, right after recording that Jesus loved this family. The sequence is deliberate. He loved them, and he waited. When he finally tells his disciples they and Oppos, re-going to Bethany, they and Oppos, re-worried. Jerusalem is only 2 miles away, and the last time Jesus was in Judea, the religious leaders tried to stone him. But Jesus says something strange, end quote, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. I am going to wake him, end quote. By the time they arrive, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. Martha hears Jesus is coming and goes out to meet him on the road. She is not meek about it. She says, with the directness of a woman who has held everything together alone for 4 days, end quote, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. End quote. There is grief in that sentence. There is love. And there is an accusation. quiet but real. You were not here. You could have been. You were not. And Jesus does not explain himself. He doesn't and oppose, justify the delay. He just asks her, end quote, do you believe that I am the resurrection and the life? End quote. She says yes. She goes back and gets her sister Mary. Mary comes and falls at Jesus and Apos' feet. The same posture as Jairus, the same posture as the leper, the same place every desperate person ends up in every miracle story, and says the exact same sentence her sister said, end quote, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, end quote. Jesus looks at her. He looks at the people weeping around her, and he is deeply moved. The Greek here is remarkable, embrameomai, which can mean troubled in spirit, but also carries a sense of indignation. Not at Mary, not at the mourners, but at death itself, at the existence of grief in the world, at the fact that the people he loved most were standing in front of a sealed tomb. Then, in the shortest verse in the entire Bible, end quote, Jesus wept, end quote. Not a polite tear. The Greek is etakrusin. He broke down and cried. The people around him see it and say, end quote, see how he loved him, end quote. Some of them, seeing this, ask quietly, end quote, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? End quote. It is a fair question, and Jesus does not answer it. Instead, he asks them to take away the stone. Martha protests, Lazarus has been dead 4 days. In the heat of Judea, in a sealed limestone tomb, for days means there is no ambiguity. This is not a coma. This is not a misdiagnosis. This is not a man who is almost dead. Jesus lifts his eyes and prays. Then he calls into the tomb with a voice loud enough that the whole crowd hears it. End quote. Lazarus, come out. End quote. The man who had been dead walks out, still wrapped in burial cloths, hands and feet bound, cloth around his face. End quote. Unbind him. End quote. Jesus says. End quote. Let him go. End quote. And now, we come back to the breath. There is a moment in Mark and Apos' 7th chapter that is almost always passed over quickly. Jesus is somewhere in the region of the Decapolis, a largely Gentile area east of the Jordan, far from the synagogues, far from the religious experts, far from the people who would be watching. A man is brought to him who is deaf and who has a severe speech impediment. Jesus takes him away from the crowd. He puts his fingers in the man and Apos' ears. He spits and touches the man and Apos' tongue. He looks up to heaven. And then, before the word, before the miracle, he sighs. The Greek is stenatzo, a sigh, a groan, the sound a person makes when they are carrying something heavy. Then he says the word, Ephatha, end quote, be opened, end quote. The man and Apos' ears are opened, his tongue is loosed, and he speaks clearly. That is our open loop resolved. That single breath before the miracle. Here's what that sigh means. Jesus, in that moment, was not sighing at the inconvenience of healing. He was not sighing at the effort. He was sighing at what the man had lived with. He was sighing at the years of isolation, the years of being unable to speak, the accumulated weight of a world that breaks people and leaves them broken. He was sighing the way a doctor sighs when they walk into a room and see someone they love in pain. Think about what that costs. A nurse who has worked a 48-hour shift, who has held 12 different hands in the last 2 days, who has watched suffering arrive in 12 different forms and done everything possible for each one. And at the end of the shift, instead of going home, walks into one more room. Not because the chart demands it, not for documentation, because there is a person in that room and the person is in pain and she cannot walk past it without going in. That is the closest human equivalent I know of dysplagnosomai. The compassion that doesn't and Apos' protect itself. Jesus did not heal from a safe distance. He entered the grief first. He wept with Mary before he called Lazarus out. He touched the leper before he spoke the word. He took the dead girl and Apos' hand before he said her name. He let power leave his body and was not afraid of what it cost. And Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, referred to Jesus simply as, end quote, a doer of wonderful works, end quote. Even his opponents Kudin and Apos' deny that things were happening. The Roman philosopher Celsus attacked the miracles as sorcery. The Talmud recorded that Jesus performed acts that Kudin and Apos' be explained away. Even the people who wanted to dismiss him had to explain what they had seen. The miracles were real, and they were personal. and they cost him something every time. So here is what we have learned across 37 miracles in 2,000 years. The first thing, Jesus healed people with splagnosomi, that gut-level, costly compassion every single time. Not from theological duty, not to prove a point, because when he saw a specific person in a specific kind of pain, something inside him moved that could not be stopped. Every miracle in the Gospels is the consequence of God being unable to look at human suffering and stay still. The second thing, he never healed to impress. The water into wine was done at night with servants as witnesses. The leper was healed on a road, not in a temple. The deaf-mute was taken aside from the crowd. The loud miracles, the feeding of 5,000, Lazarus, were loud because the need was public, not because Jesus was performing. He healed in private whenever he could. He was not interested in your applause. And the third thing, the one I want you to sit with, the miracles are not primarily proof that Jesus was divine. They are proof that Jesus saw you. That when the leper who had not been touched in years finally got close enough, Jesus saw exactly what that cost, and he reached out. That when Mary said, and quote, "If you had been here," and quote, Jesus did not defend himself. He wept. That when Bartimaeus shouted from the side of the road, and the crowd told him to be quiet, Jesus stopped walking. He stopped. In the middle of a crowd. On a road to Jerusalem. With everything he was walking toward already in motion. He stopped because a specific blind man on the side of a specific road needed to be heard. That is what the miracles are. Not a proof. A posture. A posture toward every broken person who ever got close enough to call out. Which miracle in this video hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments below. I want to know which story found you. And if this kind of content feeds your faith, please subscribe. There are more stories where this came from, and I, Don and Apos, want you to miss them. The God who stopped for Bartimaeus stops. He still stops.